Greetings, Commanders. As we approach Thursday, when the bombing of Titan Oya is supposed to begin, we wanted to share a few suggestions and guidelines on how to make the most of your experience with Titan bombing coming up on the next week. So first and foremost, this is primarily a wing-based activity for the most part, even though it is possible to do it solo. And as with all wing-based activities, it's quite helpful to make sure that port forwarding is turned on in your network options under the main menu. So if you go on the main menu of a game, you should be able to select network options and then ensure that port forwarding, which is not turned on by default, is actually turned on. That tends to help immensely with instancing with our commanders and avoid all kinds of issues and bugs that come when connections fail to happen directly and instead have to go through Elite's relay service. So before you even launch into the game, please take a moment to ensure that you have port forwarding enabled. The specifics of how that works and how to configure it in situations where your router doesn't inherently support universal plug and play are beyond the scope of this video. There are some helpful threads if you want to read them, but all in all, for the vast majority of people, just turning on port forwarding in the game is sufficient to make sure that network connections work as intended. So please take a moment to do that. Having done that, it's important to understand also how the damage mechanics to the core works and consequently how to more effectively go about Titan bombing. The core is something that takes damage by AX missiles and AX multi-cannons and AX weapons, generally speaking, only. And it'll only really take damage until going down to 0% for each cycle, which is roughly 100,000 hit points. That is the equivalent of 240 serious anti-Xeno missiles, which is the most common weapon used against Titan thermal cores. As few as 3 Titan killer crates with serious AX missiles are sufficient to zero the core in any given cycle. Any more than that is just dividing up the same amount of damage and consequently the same amount of bonds across more players in the instance. So large instances in Titan space aren't necessary. In fact, they divide up damage, which could instead be reaped up by individual commanders among a wider group, while also spawning a greater number of patrols and harder patrols. The type of patrols in terms of interceptors and glaives that are spawned in Titan space depends on the number of players in the instance. The more players, the more patrols, the harder patrols. So large instances, bad. Make sure, or at least try to, keep your instances to 3 or 4 players and ideally no more than 8, which is 2 wings at any given point in time. The problem with large instances is also related to the fact that we now better understand how the thermal core gets stuck and breaks those instances. It has to do with overlap of scripting events that happen on the client side, which end up in some kind of stuck state when a few determined events happen. One of the things that tends to get cores stuck is when more than one player goes on vent bombing runs, which is why we recommend, even in smaller instances, to have one dedicated vent bomber to see if you can minimize such events. The other event that tends to get cores stuck is when commanders join or leave the instance when the cycle of vent bombing is in play, which is also why we ask and suggest people to keep instances small and to prevent, or at least limit as much as possible, commanders from leaving or joining while the cycle of the vent bombing is active. When the core has retracted and the torus field fires, and before you start the vent bombing cycle again, with events reopening, that's when it's safe for people to join or leave the instance. As part of this, there's a trick which is actually quite important for this reason, which is if you happen to die during one of these events, which are going on, you can wait until clicking the continue button after your ship explodes, and that will prevent you from being transported to the rebuy screen. It essentially will leave you in the instance. So if possible, if you do happen to get destroyed while your fellow wingmates are on a bombing run, please wait until clicking the continue button until Victorious has fired. Then you can click continue, you'll be transported back to your carrier station, you can rearm and come back at that point. But doing so will prevent or at least limit the core getting stuck bug that we have been experiencing in so many instances in the past. If a core does get stuck, there really isn't a workaround at that point. Like, the best way to deal with stuck cores is to prevent them from getting stuck in the first place by running what we're calling closed small instances. If you're in an instance where commanders are properly connected from a network standpoint using port forwarding as we discussed, with commanders that are having a designated vent bomber, which is the one actually bombing vents themselves, and without commanders coming and going, we have found that we could avoid getting the stuck core reliably. We spent hours bombing Titan Oya in this setup and configuration without ever getting a core stuck. The moment commanders start leaving or joining, that's when we almost inevitably get the stuck core bug and then had to deal with it. Typically by resetting the instance, jumping out and coming back in, which is a pain, as you can all imagine. So those are some of the tips on how to get the better experience. Of course, if you want to try an open, or if you want to try fighting in larger instances like the AXI or XSFPGs, you're welcome to do so, but you are likely to encounter the stuck core bug, which has not been fixed yet. As a workaround, just reach out and see if 3 or 4 of those commanders are willing to split out and form a smaller PG for the purpose of Titan bombing in a smaller group following these rules, and I believe you'll find that you have a better experience. So get those Titan bombers and those Titan killers ready, and we'll see you at the Titan on Thursday. Glory to mankind, Commander Meccan, over and out.